Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Canadian Story. Today, we are joined by Janis Monture. Janis, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm great. David, you
I'm also
all right?
doing well, yes.
Janis,
It's a good day.
Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to start out the same way we always start out. Can you give us something that you love about our great country, Canada?
I think probably my most favorite thing is the diversity in our country. That's probably my most favorite thing. I've been lucky enough to meet people from all across the country through the work that I do. So I've always enjoyed learning about different cultures and their languages and their traditions. And it's very important to me as well as an Indigenous person. So I like to also share our story with them.
That's awesome. So that's a great segue. What do you do? Tell our listeners what you're all about.
Yeah, so I am the executive director of the Woodland Cultural Centre. We're located in Brantford, Ontario, and we have been in operation since 1972. So we sort of specialize in Haudenosaunee. So some people would call us, the French term is the Iroquois, but we don't refer to ourselves as that. So the Haudenosaunee people, Six Nations of the Grand River territory, and we really celebrate our cultural heritage, the arts, history, languages of our people. And we're also a museum and art gallery and a language and cultural center. But we also are on the site of the first ever residential school. So the Mohawk Institute Residential School is one of the sites on our building, on one of our sites.
That's awesome. So tell me more about the school. What exactly is the school?
So the Mohawk Institute Residential School opened in 1828, and it was at first a day school for Indigenous children who were living in and around the Mohawk village, which was started up in what is now Brantford. And then it eventually became a boarding school. And at the time, there was maybe 14 students in the original school. And then it expanded, of course, to the size of the building that it is today. There was, thousands of children, Indigenous children who went to the school. It's a very dark chapter in Canada's history. It was sort of enforced by the Indian Act to make it mandatory for Indigenous children to attend these residential schools. The one Mohawk Institute where we're located in Brantford was run by the New England Company and an Anglican church. But was also financed through, at the time, Indian Affairs. So, and of course, the Indian Act that went along with that. So the sort of the mandate of the school at that time was to assimilate Indigenous children to become more like Canadian children. So English speaking, to not celebrate their culture or speak their languages. And that was the mandate of the school, was to pretty much kill the Indian and the child, which is what the sort of one of the slogans were at that time.
Oh, that's terrible.
So it's a really dark chapter of history. A lot of people don't know about the residential school system in the country. There were hundreds of schools across Canada, but the Mohawk Institute was one of the first. It acted as like the blueprint for the rest of the schools in the country. And the Mohawk Institute closed in 1970, so not that long ago. And the last one that closed in Canada was in 1996 out west.
Okay.
So to give you a sense, so started in 1828. It really ramped up in the 1920s with the Indian Act, and that's when you saw hundreds of these schools pop up across the country. And then, the closure of most of them in the 70s.
Why do you think that became government policy? Like, what was it? It seems to me that people, generally speaking, don't do these things purely out of malice, although of course they do. It just seems so strange to me that, the Canada we know now, like you said, where we value diversity, and why was there a time in our history where we were trying to drive diversity out? Like, I'm sure you've thought about this and reflected on it.
Well, I think, there was, I think it came down to issues around land. So we know the Indigenous people were here long before the Europeans and settlers that came. And so I think a lot of it came down to government policies and access to economics and land resources. And that's when we started to see, right, the establishment of Indigenous communities put on reserve. So taken from the traditional territories where, some, my culture and specifically we were more agricultural. So we would remain in an area of land and farm it. And then when we knew that we had to make sure the land didn't sort of, we didn't take everything from it. We had to make sure that we were able to, keep it for the next generation. So we would move to a new spot. So our villages would be set up, but they would be mobilized after several years. We wouldn't just stay in one area because we wanted to make sure the land was good for down the road. And then there was other, Indigenous communities where the people would travel for hunting and gathering purposes. So they would have like winter camps and summer camps, right? So the land wasn't necessarily like how it would be today in like a town. We didn't have these establishments. So I think at that time, the government was really looking to remove us from the land for one, and then two, there was a lot of crown and treaty relationships between Indigenous people and the crown, which obviously was, the Queen of England or King of England at that time. And Canada was new. And I think they were trying to establish themselves. And I think some of that was those broken treaty promises. They weren't, and then, I think in part of their minds, they were like, well, that's treaties between them and the crown. That's not with Canada. In essence, it was, though, because it was a commonwealth. So I think that was where we saw a lot of that happening. And I think it really came down to that. And they didn't necessarily, they wanted us to, like I say, they wanted us to assimilate. They didn't want us to be a separate culture within Canadian culture.
So now, as someone who focuses so much on your culture and is able to enrich people's lives by not only the people who share your ancestry, but also to help us learn more about the history of Canada, which is what the whole purpose of the Canadian story is, right? Is to talk about what Canada is. What are some of the things you love about your culture that you're so excited that you're bringing back?
Oh, I think some of the biggest things that I love that we do and I'm very proud of is our language revitalization. So the residential school system really, in a way, one of the things it did do was sort of cut that ties between the language and that the generation, I should say just generations of kids who went to those schools where they were told you can't speak your language, you have to only speak English. And part of the reason those schools worked the way they did was that they separated the children from their parents and their families. So when you separate them from that, you lose that sense of culture, and you also lose that ability to speak your language, because now you're not speaking with your family anymore. You're speaking only with, teachers and other students, and you're all speaking English. So one of the biggest things I love to highlight is that, we are doing a lot of work in language revitalization. We do have our languages spoken in our schools now at Six Nations, not, fully immersion. We do have an immersion school, but in the other schools in the community, it's the second language, right? That's the second language program. We don't teach French. We teach our Indigenous languages. And now we have programs where adults, when you get older, if you want to relearn your language, there's immersion programs, but there's also language learning programs. And I'm a product of that. I learned language in school, but as I got older, I went back to learn more of my language. And I still have lots and lots to learn still, but that's one of the things I'm really proud of that Woodland does, is the efforts that we're putting into language revitalization. And I think one of the other things I'm really always excited to see is the younger generation really embracing their culture and their identity, because I think for so long it was not something you would talk about. Like, I remember hearing stories, my grandparents saying, like, you didn't really make it known that you were Indigenous because of the racism that exists.
Right. Yes.
So I think for a long time, I remember even being in university, not really making it known that I was Indigenous. And it was because I wasn't sure how people would react. And I think now I see the younger generation very proud to be who they are. And as am I, I'm very proud of, that I am Mohawk and that I'm from Six Nations and the work that we do. So, and I see that revitalization in the arts as well. So we have a lot of artists who are taking up other, sort of cultural art practices. So beading, for example, and the clothing and basketry, all these things now that sort of were not lost, but not necessarily always commonly practiced. We're now seeing this like huge resurgence. And I definitely would say during the pandemic, I've never bought so much beaded jewelry in my life, but I kept seeing on like a lot of the artists down here were sharing their social media because they're at home, right? So they're just like sitting at home, like, okay, well, guess I'll start making new things. And they were putting out this amazing, beadwork and new clothing that they were creating. And yeah, it's exciting. I actually have some beaded earrings on right now, but yeah, they are, it's really exciting to see that sort of celebration of our identity now.
Yeah, that is awesome. And definitely, I think something that needs to continue and flourish. I actually had the privilege of working for Shelley Glover when she was Minister of Heritage, and we oversaw a lot of that heritage funding, the grants and contributions. So that was kind of my role. So I actually remember Woodland often applying for funding, yeah. and I would always, I loved the language stuff you guys are doing. It's, I think it's so important, especially as as people who come from countries that didn't hold on to their heritage quite the same way. Right, there's a lot of melting pot in the UK, right? Like we have Viking heritage, but like we never talk about that anymore, right? So it's really cool to see people who like honor and respect their past, because I think that's actually something that Western civilization doesn't do as good of a job.
We're terrible at it.
Yeah,
we're terrible at it. I think it's something that maybe Eastern cultures do a little bit better than we do. But I love the idea of preserving where you came from. And I think the Six Nations story, I mean, for someone like me, because I'm very vested in the idea of being outdoors and hunting, and I haven't started gathering, but I joined a little foraging group on Facebook, which is really nerdy. But I look at the way those people lived before the Europeans came, and I fantasize about it. I love it. I think it's so pure and so beautiful and so wonderful. And I'm glad that there's people like you fighting for the preservation of those sorts of ideas.
Yeah, it's. I think it's really, I think it's one of the things when we talk about things around like climate change and conservation efforts. It's really, one of the things they'll say is like, well, look at what Indigenous practices used to do. We did hunt, and yeah, we did gather, and yeah, we did agriculture, but we did it in a way that we knew. We only were using what we needed. And it wasn't this mass production, and it wasn't this like, taking more than you needed, or for like a commerce driven economy, right? That's not how we were. And so I think when we're looking at how do we, you start to see things like these reforestations. And we try to do it here in our community. I mean, Six Nations, where we're located on our reserve, we have one of the largest Carolinian forests in our community. And so it's always important. And we do have farmers that live in this community too. So you have to have that balance of farmland and the forest and protecting the water. And I think that's a lot of the things that we're starting to see now. Like there's a young group of people in our community who are like, they identify themselves as water protectors, and they're not just doing like our waterways. They're thinking like more regionally and even provincially, like what are we doing? And to understand like you can't buy water technically.
No.
And I think they're trying really hard to make that known. Like,
I love that, water protectors. That is awesome.
And and they're young, like they're in university. These group of I don't want to say youth, but these group of people in our community who are really fighting for that. And and we start to see that with even ecological work that we do in the community. Even looking at from an ecotourism standpoint, because Indigenous tourism for a long time was sort of, is it just powwows? And that's not really necessarily my community. That's not necessarily our cultural practice, but you see it. And so they're trying to look at things like authenticity. They're also looking at it from like an ecotourism standpoint now. So there's now these new things that are happening in our community, which are really trying to tie in more of our cultural and traditional knowledge with what's happening today, which is, I think, really, really cool that we're trying to make those gaps and those bridges sort of become less and build communities.
That's really neat. You touched on something earlier that I wanted to ask more about. You mentioned that the communities used to occupy a space of land and then move around the land so as to not exhaust it.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in that idea. Can you give me more details? How long would they stay in a place? Like, I think that would be such a fun way to live.
Yeah. So we know from like archaeological records that our communities used to set up villages, and, you know, they would stay there for maybe like anywhere from 5 to 15 years, depending on the land, right? Because some land, obviously the soil is better than others, and you have other different variations. But, and the way we would live would be in these like villages, be surrounded by a palisade and the longhouse, which is what our traditional dwelling was.
Yeah.
The longhouses would house everyone you were related to on your mother's side. So my culture is matrilineal. So
I didn't know that.
Yes, there's actually some really cool facts. Yeah, so
drop all of the facts.
Drop all the facts on us.
Everything.
Yes.
Yeah, so the Haudenosaunee people live in a matrilineal society. So some really cool things about this and interesting, and I like to teach this to school children, is that
consider
women,
me one of your school children.
Yeah.
yeah, so women would actually choose the chiefs. They're known as clan mothers, and the clan mother is the one who identifies what male will become a chief. The clan mother is also the one, if they're not doing their job, can dehorn them. That's what we have. That's the term we use. So they can dehorn them, and they can no longer be chief. Women also are sort of seen as the caretakers of the land. So we were the ones traditionally who would, you know, do a lot of the gardening and setting up the food supply, right? And also prepare the food. So we were entrusted with taking care of the land. And when you got married, you moved in with your wife and her family. Huh. And divorce is very frowned upon, but if you were to get divorced, the husband has to move out.
Right.
The woman stays, right? It's her family. That's who you moved in with.
Yeah.
And we have a clan system. So I know you guys probably understand a little bit of clans with Scottish history. Yep. So we have a clan system as well. We have 9 clans in our culture. So we identify them as like 3 land, 3 air, and 3 water. So like the 3 land clans are, you know, deer, wolf, and bear. The 3 air are hawk, heron, and snipe. And the 3 water is eel, beaver, and turtle. So I'm Mohawk turtle. That's my clan. You are born with your clan and you die with your clan. So it doesn't change. So, but you follow your mothers. So my dad's a bear clan. My mother's a turtle clan. I'm turtle. If I were to have a son, he would be turtle because he's got to follow the mother's line, right? And when you get married, your clan doesn't transfer. You keep your clan. That's how it works. So you technically aren't supposed to be marrying within your clan because that's seen as family. It's family.
Oh,
okay.
Interesting. Right. Okay. Right.
Yeah. So you have to marry someone from a different clan. Even when we sit together in Longhouse, even today in ceremony, we sit according to our clan. So imagine the Longhouse sort of as like a rectangular structure, split in half. The women will sit on this side, the men sit on this side, and you sit according to your clan. So I'm Mohawk turtle, so I would sit on my bench right here. And my cousins, for example, who are Mohawk turtle, they sit just down on the other side of the Longhouse. And so my grandmother used to say, like, you should never be looking down that bench, you know, because you can't marry them.
Oh, right.
Right. So you gotta like look across the way or, you know, a different clan. But we sit according to our clan. So like when I sit in Longhouse, it's like the turtles and then the wolves are right next to us. And then you kind of go around and the different clans come around. But the women all sit on the side.
Which clan is the biggest?
Well, it depends. It depends in the community too, right? So like different nations have different clans that kind of get tied to them a lot. So like Mohawks, you tend to see a lot of turtle, wolf, and bear. But there's other clans that kind of come into that. But those are in Mohawk nation. Typically, those are the ones you see a lot. Like
Okay.
when I go to Longhouse, there's a lot of like turtles and wolves. And bears.
Right. Makes sense.
How often
so
do you
there's
go?
some that.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
How often do you go to Longhouse? Like, is that a regular thing for you?
No, so it's like, so we kind of have like 13 ceremonies a year. And if you kind of look at a turtle's back, they have 13.
Really?
So kind of ties. Yeah, it's
That's
interesting.
beautiful.
Interesting, huh?
See, I love that stuff.
Nature,
I
it's
love
all
that
connected
stuff.
to nature.
So there's 13 ceremonies a year. And they last anywhere from 1 day to 10 days in length. So some ceremonies, I have to admit, I don't go to every one. But there are some that you typically always go to. So for example, we have midwinters, which usually happens, it depends. It's around like the stars and the moon of that time of year. So like late January, early February is usually when midwinters happens. And that ceremony goes from roughly 10 days. But they're not like full days necessarily. Like we usually get there early in the morning and, sometimes we leave around 1:30. So it just depends. And it depends how long the ceremonies are, because all the ceremonies are a bit different. But yeah, so they last. So it's not like we go every Sunday. It's not like church.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
What I just was wondering. So, what is? Can you walk us through what a ceremony would look like?
You asked the same question I was going to ask.
Not really. It's kind of one of those things that if you're in the
it's
culture,
a secret. Fair enough.
Not really
okay.
a secret, but it's very ceremonial,
personal,
right? So there are certain things we're not allowed to sort of share.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that there is still an element of secrecy that you and maybe privacy is a better word.
Yeah, it's just something that we kind of keep within our culture. There's like you can read. I'm sure there's some stuff out there that's already been produced or published, but we usually just sort of say like it's sort of a time of renewal. I guess is the best way to describe it.
Right.
It's that time of year, and you're also you're being thankful for a new year. In a way, right? So it's like renewal, just being thankful for it. There's a lot of speeches. I'll just say this, like there's speeches, there's some dancing, and there's some food.
Right.
Great. Sounds like a good time.
It's a really good time to be reflective, I find.
Right. So you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but we had Ellis Ross on, and he talked about the anger he felt when he realized what had happened to his ancestors and what that had done to the community that he loved, and then how he worked through that. And I mean, I think the greatest challenge facing Canada is how are we going to find this path to reconciliation after what happened? And if that can be whoever can help us get through that, I think will have done the greatest service to Canada of anyone. So what kind of path do you see? How have you walked that path? And like, how do you deal with that? I know that if that happened to my family, I'd be pretty angry. But I know that anger is also a largely useless emotion, right? In the sense of it only hurts us. It doesn't generally hurt the people we're angry with. So I was just wondering if you wanted to share, because I think that is part of the Canadian story that isn't being told, is not just what happened, but how do we reconcile?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It's there's a lot of conversations about that term reconciliation, and does it even exist in this country after the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. I think for me, I kind of look at it sort of 2 points. I think I grew up in a community very close. Obviously, I knew the residential school existed because my mom used to work there, and I was a summer student for many years, so I was very conscious of that. I was also very conscious of family members who attended residential school. It's interesting because it wasn't really discussed when I was younger. It was something that kind of came out when I was probably in my late teens, early 20s. So you're looking at circa, like, I'm going to age myself a little here, but like 1998 to about 2003, where sort of conversations were starting to happen more about residential school and what it was. I don't necessarily, I think maybe I'm different because I work in a place where we're trying to do the exact opposite of what those schools stood for. I'm working to try to revitalize our culture. I'm there to revitalize the language. It's really important for me. It's really important to celebrate our culture and the arts and everything beautiful about our people. That's not to say that I don't discuss some of those harder conversations, but I think people just listening and being open to hear what is going to have to be said, because it's not easy to talk about.
No.
And when I do tours of the school when we were open, every tour I did was different. And it's different because I would, share the historical facts, which I always sort of rely on. And that's based off a lot of the primary research we have accessible at our facility. But I also interweave it with, those personal stories that I have from my family. I think for me, it's just making sure that never, ever happens again is the biggest takeaway I think we can take. And I think there's still that issue. If you look at it from the child welfare system in this country, when you look specifically at, that system in Indigenous communities, and what still is happening and those failures to those systems. I mean, there's a lot of cases, in the country that children were still put in harm's way or were not addressed, or maybe not in a culturally sensitive way. And I think those are things that still need to be addressed in this country, is looking at the inequities of children who come from Indigenous communities, whether it's urban or on reserve, to those that are non-Indigenous. And I think those are conversations that we still need to have in this country, because there's huge inequities. There's huge inequities when you look at services provided in communities. What I would get if I lived, and I've lived off reserve, I went to school, in London and in Ottawa, the access to service and programs is so much higher in those larger urban settings than it is in, smaller remote communities. And my community is one of the largest First Nations populated in this country. We have over, 26,000 members, 13,000 roughly that live on reserve. It's a large First Nation. So when people say to me, do you know so-and-so from Six Nations? There's a good chance I might not know who they are.
Right.
But I think, and we live in Southwestern Ontario, which has tons of, access. Like, I've been to communities where it's a 3-hour drive to the next town. Like, so whenever I say like there's stuff that's wrong in my community, it's not even at par with some other First Nations communities that I've visited. We're very lucky where we're situated. We have a lot of access to things, but there's still a huge issue. And I look at it from, looking at tuition funding agreements for our students who go to school on reserve to those who don't. And I think there's a lot of things that we're trying to do to make sure that we can, in our own way, provide that and be, sort of self-sufficient and not rely on government funding, because that's not necessarily what we want to do. We just want to be able to sort of play at the same, let's play at the same game. Right. Shall I say,
Right, yeah.
Why is there such this sort of already unequal footing when we go? So things like, I'm very proud to sit, I proudly serve in my community. It's very important for me. But I look at things like, historically the land claims in this country. My father was a land claims director for 25 plus years. So I know a lot of that process around specific claims and land claims in this country and how it doesn't work. But also looking at, there are solutions to this, but the government is very hesitant to move on those solutions. And so when I talk about that, and a lot of people get scared when they hear the term land claims, they immediately are like, does that mean you're taking the land back? That's not necessarily what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, how do we share the land? How do we both have prosperity on that land that was traditionally ours? It was our treaty, specifically for Six Nations. It's the Haldeman Treaty. This tract of land was over 960,000 acres. We live on less than 5% of that now.
Wow.
Right.
So you have to understand, and I think when people look at that, they go, well, why is it like that? And it's like, well, that was years of, colonization happening.
Yeah.
Government policy, people selling the land, and it was going back into the government's purse. Yeah. And that's literally what was happening to us. We pretty much financed Upper Canada. by the sale
by people
of the
just
land.
selling it. Yeah.
And so I think when we talk about that idea of reconciliation, I think it's not just looking at the residential school system. I think you have to really start to peel back the layers. And, people ask me like, well, the land protectors and the protests in Caledonia and the protests in Brantford and the protests in other parts of this country. And the general Canadian public, I think, probably wonder, why is it happening? Us protesting and us going to the government and writing letters and doing everything that we were told to do, you now have younger generations who are starting to get fed up. And it's because these things haven't been addressed for hundreds of years. And we're seeing development go on these traditional territories, part of our treaty lands, and people going, well, why isn't this, why isn't it being resolved? And, I've seen my dad do this for years, and the frustrations he's had with working within the government system and working within the court system. But they're all Canadian courts. They're all Canadian government. So already we're going into a system that's not designed to help us in any way, right? We weren't even allowed to hire lawyers, until like after the 1960s. Yeah. So like, do you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of people I think just don't understand like how Canada came to be and how its relationship with Indigenous people is just, it's incredibly complicated. And there's a lot of layers that have to be peeled back. And we try to talk about that, in our museum, like this is what land claims are. And people always say, well, why do you want the land? And why do you want the land back? And it's like, it's not for us. It's not for those who are here. It's for those who are yet to come. And we have this philosophy, like everything we do, every decision we make, we are supposed to think of those faces yet to come. And the language is actually much beautifully said, but that's what it means. Is like everything we do and every decision we make, it's not for us. It's how is it going to impact those people who aren't here yet? Our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. That's how we think. We're not thinking of here and now. We're thinking like into the future. And if we don't try to preserve or save that, then we've let them down. And we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. So I think when people ask us questions about that, and do you think that, I think it's the willingness to be listened, to be open, to be educated, to understand, but also to try to be part of the solution. And I think, I don't have all the answers and I don't know what those are yet, but I think, we're also put into systems that aren't necessarily made to help us. So it's trying to break down those systems. And I don't know if that will happen, but that's sort of something that we hope to strive for.
So you said, talking about ways forward, to listen, to be educated. I want to expand on that a little bit more. Whether you can fault me for it or not, I consider myself fairly ignorant in terms of what happened, what is currently happening. I don't think that there was a lot of information available to me growing up. It wasn't anything like I remember the Caledonia protest and just like not understanding what was going on and not really having good access to information why that was happening. So my question is, as someone who cares but is ignorant, where can I go to immerse myself in the culture, to learn more about it? I mean, obviously your center right now is closed, but what are the options available to people who do want to be a part of the solution?
There's some really great options to learn. So one of the things I always tell people is look for that community. Go online. Most of our First Nations communities have websites. So Six Nations, it's sixnations.ca. And on there, you can actually look at different resources and publications that they've produced from our community. And one of them is called Global Solutions. And this specifically talks about that history of the land claim and the treaty of Six Nations, like the Haldeman Treaty. And it talks a bit about why Caledonia happened. And it really breaks down about the idea of the treaty, how it was sort of parceled off and sold and still under land claim or under 999-year leases, because we did have those. We were technically thinking like we knew we were going to have to share the land with settlers. Settlers were coming in whether we liked it or not. That was just going to happen. And the squatters were happening. So they actually built, a perfect example is Brantford Town Plot. So our idea was like get all the squatters and put them all kind of like on their reserve, but like in a town plot, right? So like move them and have them in one area. Like, okay, let's get them off all over the place and let's put them in like sort of this town plot. And that was what was established, but that wasn't paid for. No one was paying for it. We just sort of did that. And there was the agreement that we would have these 999-year leases, and then they would come back up for renewal. Like we knew we weren't totally trying to be like, no one can live here, but we were understanding what was happening. But none of those were sort of honored down the road. There have been some additions to reserve. There is a way to add land back to the reserve. And we do have some of those. And some families, said, we knew it was a 990-year lease. And some of these were farming families. And they said, okay, no one else in the family wants to continue. We're going to give it back. So there is some of that was happening, but for the most part, no. And there's a lot of issues around some of the land that even the government was utilizing on our tract. So I always say to people, go to those First Nations communities. Most of us have stuff about our history, about the different types of languages that are spoken in our community. They talk a little bit about our sort of culture. They'll talk a little bit about the arts, and they usually will address some things around treaties or land and the different types of services and what you can find in the community, different events that happen in the community. Those are all, if you can go, you can check out those websites. And like I said, we do have a library on site if we were open, but obviously we're closed. But you can find some information on our website as well. But yeah, I definitely encourage people, if they are wanting to know more, is look to those communities, because we don't have a lot of stuff necessarily published or written about our community, but there are some really great historians from our community who are now publishing work. So we are seeing a little bit more of that happen now than before, but there are some really great information out there.
Okay. I wanted to touch on one more thing really quickly, a very small thing that you said right at the beginning of the podcast. You said Iroquois is a French pronunciation that isn't really what you would use, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. Because I've only you said the other one and I can't repeat it because it's the first time I heard it and I probably couldn't say it anyway. But
so I can do different.
What happened there? What is that story?
So the French named us. It was like their terminology was the Iroquois. That's what they named my people. And it stayed like that for many, many years. Until, we really started to refer back to our language and how we would refer to ourselves as our people in our language. And it's something I'm really, really cognizant of at the Cultural Center, that we try to use our language as much as possible. So Haudenosaunee, the way I'm saying it right now, is the Cayuga translation. And what it means is people of the Longhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it means, right? The other term you'll hear a lot when people refer to the Six Nations, or the Six Nations Confederacy, we now call it the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, but people will say the Six Nations Confederacy, is Ongwehome. And Ongwehome, again, is both the Mohawk and Cayuga word. They're spelled different, but it means the original people. So we say, Haudenosaunee is the Cayuga one. In Mohawk, so in my language, it's Lenape. So it kind of sounds similar. That means people of the Longhouse. And then Ongwehome means the original people. Now, I can't do all of these, of the six, because there's 6 nations. So the 6 nations are Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora. But up until like the 1750s, we were really only Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Seneca. The Tuscarora joined later. I think 1764 roughly. And then they joined. So we were 5 Nations Confederacy, then we became the 6 Nations Confederacy. And now we refer to ourselves as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee people, or the Ongwehome people. And in my language, so when I usually introduce myself, I can do a short introduction. So I'll tell you how it's important to introduce yourself properly in your language. So I'll be doing it in Mohawk. So I usually will say, Gahondo de Youngyuts, Kahaga, Nimagut Majonto, Atnawala Nuwagit Delonto. And what I said was, my Mohawk name is Gohondukta, which means she's like at the edge of the land, edge of the grass.
Yeah.
That's my Mohawk name. Ganyat Gahaga is how you say Mohawk in my language. Ganyat Gahaga. And Atnawala is turtle. So I'm Turtle Clan. So I was saying, my name, I don't say myself as Janis Monture, that's my English name, but my Mohawk name is Gohondukta. I'm getting at Gahaga in Mohawk Nation, Atnawala.
Is that first and last name that you're saying?
No, my first name is just my traditional name. My traditional Mohawk name is Gohondukta. That's just all it is.
Okay. That's
I like it. It's just a concept. It's not right.
So our language is verb based. So anytime you say something, it's a verb in it. So that's, and anything we do, like for example, we have a performing arts series, and it translates to "we are entertaining."
Oh, I love that.
Do you know what I mean? So it's, or we have another one, a film series. It's called We Watch Films. We watch movies.
I love it.
So it's the language is quite beautiful, very long. If you ever look at Mohawk words, if you saw what I wrote, like what I just said, it's quite long. The words are quite long. It's hard. It's one of the hardest languages to learn is Mohawk, actually. But yeah, so I just started going back into learning my language. I learned Cayuga growing up, going to school on reserve. And then when I went to high school, I learned French. And then when I got older, I was like, okay, I want to learn actually what my language is, which is Mohawk, because I learned Cayuga growing up. So to this day, I can still sing happy birthday in Cayuga, and I can do my numbers in Cayuga. I can do my numbers in Mohawk now, but I'm starting to get a bit more of my Mohawk language back. But I do know a lot more Cayuga than I do Mohawk.
How much interplay is there between the languages, in the sense that between the two languages that you've worked on, are there a lot of shared words, or are they drastically different?
There's similarities. Like, so we have a thing that we do when we open it, like when we come together, we do an opening and a closing. We call it, in Cayuga, this is like my brain's going. In Cayuga, we call it the Gunyohunyo, means the Thanksgiving address. In Mohawk, we call it the Ahenda Golewidakwa, which means the words that come before all else. When we gather, we say this, and we always you'll get the short version or the long version. The long version's quite lengthy. The short version's about roughly 5 to 7 minutes long. So in the Gunyohunyo or the Ahenda Golewidakwa, there are some words I can totally hear in both languages. They're close. But there's things like, I guess a really good example is salt. In Cayuga is ojikeda, and then it's ojikeda in Mohawk, but it's sugar.
Oh.
So you got to be careful at the table. You might be asking the next you're talking to. You might get salt in your cereal, or you might get sugar in your pasta, or something like that. Yeah.
Oh man, that's funny. That's really funny.
They're linguistically, all of the 6 languages are actually linguistically
So is it almost like the Latin roots? Like it has a root system that's the same?
There's a root,
yeah.
It's a root. There's a root word, as we call it. It's like a root word methodology.
Yes, right.
Language, yeah.
Do all of the languages share the same characters? No? That's complex.
Yeah, so Cayuga's very unique. When I look at theirs, they have little glottals that we don't have in Mohawk. And you actually have to have a specific keyboard to do Cayuga, like if you do Cayuga written translations. Mm-hmm. So in Cayuga, we call them Gayakono. That's what it means. Cayuga is Gayakono. That's how they refer to themselves. So in Gayakono, you have to have a special keyboard. You kind of need one too for Mohawk, but Cayuga specifically, because they have these symbols that aren't in Mohawk. Specifically the glottals, I find. It's and the different types of letters that are used, like their alphabet's different than ours in Mohawk and Cayuga. So like there's a lot of G's and N's and H's in Cayuga. In Mohawk, you'll see a lot of R's, T's, K's, versus Cuba. It's like very, so like things in, so like, for example, people will ask me some words like Otnawala. How you spell it is A-N-O colon R-A. The R's are like L's. Otnawala.
Oh. What, so one of the things that I love, and I know Zach loves most about being a human, is music, song, storytelling, and I love how those things are all incorporated in your culture. But what's one of your favorite stories from your culture? Like, what's a legend?
It's interesting. It's interesting. We don't have a lot of what you would term as legends. And certain, like if you look in like Ojibwe or Cree communities, they have a lot more legends than we do. We have a couple. There's one about the Seven Dancers, which is roughly like Pleiades.
Right.
Yeah. And then we have one of kind of a story about Maid of the Mist at Niagara Falls.
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
What's
I don't
that
know
one?
them by heart. I don't know them by heart. I don't,
We're putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
I know. I don't know them by heart. I just know we did a project with CBC like years ago, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. And we did the translation of these stories from Cuba into English. And so it was like, there was one about the bear, the hunters. Yeah, hunting of a bear.
Right.
And there's like the Seven Dancers, and then there was one of Maid of the Mist, and I can't remember the other one. But those are ones I kind of sort of remember. But I do like the Seven Dancers is more around Pleiades.
Yeah.
We have like, I don't know. It's not really like, we don't really have a lot of legends like that normally where we would sit around, but we're very much an oral history community, right?
Yeah.
So I love hearing family or community stories. Like I love asking my great aunts and uncles for stories about like what it was like growing up when they were young, or just different things that have happened in our family. Like I love hearing those stories because it gives me a perspective of like what it would have been like to live in the community at a certain time. They used to actually make us, when we were in grade 7 and 8, you used to have to interview like your grandparent or a neighbor, and you had to like learn how to like engage with them. And I remember it was like the first time I ever made tea for my grandma, and I think I totally messed it up. But they would tell us like what it was like, you know, like my grandpa telling me a story about like how far you had to walk to get to school, and what school was like when he was young. And yeah, it was just really, really interesting. And there's like stories of when they used to catch the train in Caledonia because there was a train station. Like it's so interesting, like the stories, and like how my dad and a couple of my uncles played baseball at the CNE. Like those really like stories that I'm just like, really? Like, and thinking back, like you didn't have but how did you all fit in the car? Like, those questions. And going to Toronto, like that would have been a huge deal for them. So yeah, I like hearing more of those sort of stories of stuff happening at certain points in time, and like how there used to be a ferry. So to get across the Grand River in our community, there used to be a ferry you had to take there before the bridge was built in 1984. So, or you had to drive all the way around to get to the other side. So yeah, like there's some really cool stories. Like I remember some of the things when I was young. We don't really have legends, and like songs, like we still have our social dances and songs that, you know, every time I hear it, I know exactly what song it is. In our, that we still have, and the kids still learn today, which is really important, I think. And it's interesting because when I was young, smoke dance, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen it or heard about it. So it's kind of like a competition. A lot of our dances in our culture, it's not like powwow style, right? It's very different. So our dances tend to be very simplistic, very like just dancing in a circle and either single file or you are coupled up. But smoke dance is very performance. It's very fast. The feet are really fast. And it's like men and women do it, and they can put some style into it. So sometimes like when they're smoke dancing, they'll end and they'll go like they're shooting an arrow or something. Like they have these like different styles into it.
Nice.
It's very fast. But when I was young, I didn't really know smoke dancing that well till I got a bit older. Like I didn't really see it because all I would see as like our social dances.
Right.
But yeah, so that sort of, you know, when I started working at Woodland, we had the smoke dance competition. That's sort of my first exposure to it, was seeing it there. And now it's like, you know, it's very popular. People like to smoke dance.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So there's some really, really cool things. And like, we have like unique things, like food obviously plays a huge part in our culture. So there's certain foods that we eat and certain dishes. And like, you know, when you go to different communities, you like, you know, like my mom is from Akwesasne, so it's another Mohawk community near Cornwall, Ontario. And so the way they make corn soup is very different from how they make corn soup here at Six Nations. So like I'm always kind of like, oh, I grew up, my dad makes corn soup. I like my dad's corn soup. And then when I go to Akwesasne, I'm like, oh, this is different. You know, because it's a different way of making it, right? And my mom loves that kind. My mom loves, you know, but that's what she grew up in, right? So there's like subtle differences.
There's nostalgia there too.
Yeah. So yeah, food's a huge part in our community. Like, it's really like, you can't really go to an event without having food. It's such a part of what we are. And, you know, whenever I do events at Woodland, I always have to have a food budget.
Yeah.
Because we have to have food. We have to have food there because people are going to expect it. Like, that's just part of who we are. It's like when people come to your house, like, oh, do you want something to eat? Do you want something to drink? Like, that's just, you know, just something we do. And there's like practices in our community that, you know, still have existed. Like, not this year, obviously, because of last year or this year, because of COVID. But like, we have bread and cheese, which is always Victoria Day weekend. And everyone always asks me, like, what is bread and cheese? I'll reference it like the other, you know, like I'll say certain things and I'll be like, it was like bread and cheese in there. People are, if you're from here, you know exactly what that means. But if you're not, they're like, what is bread and cheese?
Right.
So bread and cheese is our way of celebrating our sort of allegiance, I guess, as allies of the British. So Queen Victoria originally gave us blankets as her way of saying thank you to us for all our allies in the wars and everything else that happened. And then we became, and then the community just sort of took it on, and we started, hey, I don't really understand how it became bread and cheese, but you line up, you go to the arena and in the Schwiegen in our village, and you go through and everyone lines up and you have your little bag ready. You get bread and cheese and everyone eats bread and cheese.
Wow.
Like the whole community comes for it. It's actually kind of like it's kind of an event now. So there's like, you know, there's like a carnival and there's like vendors and there's other food trucks and there's like, you know, rides and there's other stuff that goes on that sort of week because it has now become Community Awareness Week. It's sort of a larger community initiative. Right. So like there's like the pageant, there's, you know, like track and field day and games and stuff like that. And all the different community services and businesses can open up as like open houses that week. So people will get to know.
Right.
And there's like draws and free food, like free lunches, free barbecues that happen it used to be a week. Now I feel like it's almost 2 weeks long because there's so many things happening. Yeah. And it's like super, super fun. And it's been weird because we didn't have it last year. And it's such a huge part of like our community coming together. But when you go to Bread and Cheese Day on May 2, like Victoria Day, what we call it Bread and Cheese Day, it's like the whole community comes together and you see people you haven't seen in a while. And like a lot of extended family who maybe don't live here anymore come back for that weekend. And so there's many times like I'll say something like, oh, I was at blah, blah, blah. It was like bread and cheese in there, right? Like, because it's like you see everyone from the community, right? So, so we have that still as part of our community sort of celebrations. And then we also a thing that we have still is like, we call it Nuyain. It's like January 1st, so the new year. You go from house to house and you go Nuya, to wish everyone Happy New Year, and you get little baked goods.
Oh, nice! So it's like it's Halloween and New Year's together,
kind of. Oh, yeah. But yeah, you get some baked goods and you get some like fruit, and it's like you're well wishing your neighbors, right? Like Happy New Year.
You're building community. It's all about building community.
It's so beautiful, and I love that emphasis on family and on community that I feel like I see out of that culture. I wish we gave more effort to that as a Western society in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too.
Yeah, so it's one of I guess that's probably why I love to live and work in my community, because it's important for me to give back. Like I went away to school and I came back, and it's really important for me to work in my community and to live and to give back as much as I can, like volunteer and do other things and help out at community events. Like that's really important for me. But yeah, I love our traditions and sort of love what we do here in the community. And it's not, it's complicated at times, but it's, it's just what I love.
Well, I'm glad you got to share that love with us. I felt your love for it, and I'm just honored that you would come and share that with us, because more people need to live like you're living right now. And thank you for also just sharing with us about the past and about ways that maybe that we can go forward. But I think if we keep up these kind of conversations, that's the way forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's just I think there's always sort of common ground between people. And I think if you just put aside some things, like some of the differences, you can kind of find that common humanity between all of us. And like I said, that's why I kind of like the diversity in this country, is because I can always talk to people from different cultures and share, we do with this, and then we do this, and and you can find those common grounds. Yeah,
absolutely. And being able to find that is the only way we're going to be able to move forward. Right? That if we can all be like, oh, we're humans together.
Yeah.
And how are we going to love being human together?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people understanding that there is some difficult past. But it's also a shared history. And I think people forget that. They always think, oh, that's your perspective or that's your history. It's like, no, actually we shared it. We just weren't there, but it is shared.
But it
was shared. It was shared. Yeah.
Well, Janis, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for coming on and having a conversation with us and sharing all of your knowledge. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. So thank you very much.
Nawagoa, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.